Hi, I'm Gabriel Donlevy, Professor of Accounting and Business Ethics at UNE, and I'm going to take you through this course in professional ethics. Here is the introductory lecture, which I'm giving from home, starting right now. We're in a course that looks like it's very scholastic, and it is. It looks like it's scientific, but it's not, because science is about what is, ethics is about what we should do, how we should behave, how we should think and feel, how we should be to other people. And that's very different from science, which looks at why we do what we do and why the world is how it is and how the world is how it is. Ethics rules about what we should do, rules about how we should be with each other. Where do we get our ethics from? If you're religious, if you were alive in previous generations to today, you would believe ethics comes from God. If you're religious now, you still believe that. And that the commandments, 10 commandments for the Jews, the Christians, and to a certain extent Muslims too, are in the Bible, but that the word of God is interpreted by the prophets, Moses for the Jews, Jesus for the Christians, the Prophet Muhammad for the Muslims. The holy books elaborate what God wants of us, and the priests, especially the high priests, like in Christianity, the bishops, tell us what the right thing to do is according to religion. So one primary source of what we believe is right and wrong is the religious movements of the world. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism. If you are agnostic or atheist, you don't believe in God, you don't ascribe to any religion, the authority that religious people ascribe to it. And in that case, you would probably think that the source of our ethics, what we believe is right and wrong, comes from our basic animal nature. Inside our basic animal nature are our cells. Inside the cells are chromosomes. Inside the chromosomes are genes. And according to a leading atheist scientist writer called Dawkins, human behavior is primarily driven by genetics, and the primary driver of genetic behavior is to keep reproducing itself, and he characterizes this behavior as the selfish gene, so that we do what we do in order to reproduce ourselves. So we have sexual desire, we have kids, and we bring them up in order to reproduce ourselves. Now, this is his theory. It's not necessarily fact. Another thing that arises from having an animal nature is that we are members of a family, and even if we have problems with being a member of a family, perhaps we're orphans, for example, we nevertheless belong to a race or a clan, and clan instincts, family values, greatly dictate what we believe is right or wrong, what gets us approval and what doesn't, as I shall be elaborating in a later lecture. So, two primary sources of ethics so far: God and religion on the one hand, animal nature and what results from an animal nature, and being a member of a family or a clan on the other hand. Next, might. The religions of the world have arisen organically in their original countries, such as Hinduism in India, but they also went out to conquer other countries and impose the religion by right of conquest. So the Spanish people in their big century, the 16th century, when they went out to South America, they massacred the local population and made them all become Catholic Christian. So their might dictated what became right. if you are religious, you believe that God is in charge of the entire universe and creation, and that God is good, and that God is almighty. It's God Almighty. So the might that you think is right is the might that comes from God. Other kinds of might coming from the state, the police, the army, conquest, we don't necessarily think that's right, but since we don't want to die, usually, we do what we're told. So simple strength has some influence on what we believe to be right and wrong, or if it doesn't affect what we believe, it certainly affects our behavior, because we don't, on the whole, want to be singled out for pain and punishment. So we tend to behave in a way that avoids it. And that is the sense in which might is right on a civil or secular sort of a level. Another source of ethics is conscience. Many people believe that conscience is inherent, that there's a part of the brain that actually carries it, and that inherent in being an animal, even more in being a human, is that you have a conscience. That is, you have some sympathy and empathy with others that makes you instinctively avoid causing harm to others. Some people believe that. It's noticeable that there are some people that don't appear to have a conscience, and these days we tend to call such people psychopaths, or if they're not so dangerous, sociopaths. And that very act means that we're assuming that most people do have some sort of conscience, and that conscience is a source of ethics, in particular a source of feeling what we owe other people and what we owe other people to avoid. So a source of guilt and shame, which we elaborate in topic number 3. Next, if you're religious but you're also selfish, and most of us are quite selfish, then the fact that you're religious means you probably believe in an afterlife and heaven, and you accept what your religion tells you, that you have to be good to get to heaven. So one source of good behavior is your aspiration to climb the stairway to heaven, in the words of the famous Led Zeppelin pop song from 1970. So you can be selfish and yet behave good because you want to earn points that get you promoted to heaven and avoid hell. There's a very excellent American TV serial that's finished that you can get on YouTube called The Good Place, that goes into a lot of depth on this in a very entertaining way. I'll come back to that later in the course. Source of ethics for most of us, most of the time, are our parents. So we inherit from them what they believe to be good and bad, what they believe to be right and wrong. Even if we're rebellious against our parents, we are still rebelling in a direct line opposite to them. So if they believe black is black and we want to rebel, then we say black is white. We don't say it's red. The rebellion is a direct opposition to what the parents believe. But most of us inherit most of what our parents believe. Indeed, many parents believe, many people believe it's the primary job of parents to teach kids the difference between right and wrong, to get them to behave in a way that people think is good, that gets them approval, and that enables them to fit into society. So parents are a major source of ethics. Of course, the parents themselves got their ethics from their parents, and so on back to one of the first two, God and religion on the one hand, or animal nature on the other hand, maybe a bit of a combination of both. And the final major source of ethics are the groups to which we belong: our family, our clan, our race, our country, our religion, our neighborhood. These all have their norms. Our professions have their norms, and the professional ethics are the norms of the professional group. So that's a quick introduction to primary sources of ethics. There are two broad types of ethical framework. One is universalism and the other is relativism. Universalism believes that ethics are like scientific physics forces like gravity or electromagnetism. They believe that for something to be right or wrong, it must be right or wrong everywhere for everybody all the time. So that right or wrong, good and evil, are like the speed of light or gravity and invariant across all possible and all actual universes. So this is viewing ethics as very nearly solid, palpable, and susceptible to scientific analysis. They say if an ethic isn't universal, it isn't really an ethic. And the content of ethic, the center of ethics in a universalist view, is minimizing pain and maximizing joy. Instead of joy, I could have said happiness, I could have said pleasure, but people think that's a little superficial sometimes, whereas joy is transcendent and sublime. So the idea of the word is the highest possible state of pleasure, enjoyment, happiness that you can get, and joy seems to be a better word for that. Pain, on the other hand, we all know what that is, minimizing pain. Some religions say, in fact, aspects of all religions say you must sometimes suffer pain in order to be good, in order to do the right thing, but it's always regarded as a sacrifice. It's always regarded as something that is on the way to something else. No religion has the idea that you should be in as much pain as possible. Some religions, notably early Christianity, believe that if you are bad, you go to hell, and in hell you get a lot of pain. But very few religions believe that the idea of ethics, the idea of right and wrong, is to get yourself in pain. They pretty much all believe that the idea is to minimize it. Then we have things that have happened since the Second World War, which ended in 1945. We've got the idea of human rights being universal. We've got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the United Nations, which is supposed to be universal as well on this planet. And universal means no exceptions, whether for minorities, for intellectually disabled, for physically disabled, for criminals even. Universal means universal. Next aspect of universalism is that the ethical truths are believed to be self-evident. The American Constitution talks about certain truths being self-evident, life, liberty, and the right to pursue happiness, they say, is self-evident. But nothing can be self-evident unless everybody agrees it's there. So you say something is self-evident, and even if you're a Thomas Jefferson or another founding father in the States, you are making a subjective judgment that it's self-evident. It's not like touching something or seeing something, which really is self-evident. You're saying it's self-evident, but it's your opinion. It's not necessarily a fact. The things that go with universalism as being regarded as good, and therefore as virtues: loving, caring, nurturing, bonding, being fulfilled, being healthy, comfort, sense of belonging, that's an important one, and optimism. I say belonging is an important one because the others are not so controversial, but the trying to get a sense of belonging seems to be really important in understanding who commits crimes and who doesn't, and therefore who might cheat financially and who might not. We'll come back to it. Then, universalism is the enemy of selfishness, of tribalism, of fascism, nationalism, religious elitism. It's the enemy of spoiling your kids. It's the enemy of corruption. It's the enemy of favoritism. And it's the enemy of unmerited privilege, because it says all human beings are equally endowed with rights, and therefore privileging any one of them in any sense is unethical. This is subject to a few caveats, which we'll get onto later, but you've got the basic idea there. And that's universalism. And its opposite is relativism. Now, in universalism, the traditional good word is good or right. But in relativism, the top word of praise is appropriate. Behaviour should be appropriate. Appropriate to what? The cultural context. Now, just as good manners and clothing styles vary from country to country, generation to generation, in relativism, ethical norms arise from their cultural context, so they are clearly not universal because they come from a cultural context. And a cultural context is not the entire world. Not in this day and age, anyway. Maybe in the future. And for a relativist, it's more important to adapt to your environment, your context, your neighbourhood, than it is to be convinced that you are basically right. So a big difference between a relativist and a universalist. Universalist believes in conviction. A relativist believes in adaptation. Relativism is loosely associated with Darwinism and social Darwinism. What's the difference? Darwinism is the idea of survival of the fittest, that nature picks out the species, the traits that make for adaptation best. Just switch that off. And so social Darwinism is the idea that what applies in nature in the jungle also applies in society, and so the fittest survive. It underpins a particular view of the capitalist system and market forces, where the market is the jungle, and whoever's strongest and fittest to survive does best. Relativism is also strongly associated with anthropology, the study of different peoples, different tribes, with care theory, which we'll be coming on to in topic 4, and with the law of any one land, because different countries have different laws, and different laws result in different sense of what's right and wrong. So here, the sense of what's right and wrong is associated with the law, and the law itself is not universal, but comes from national legislation. Relativism tends to rate freedom and property over justice and equality or equity. So, you have the idea, particularly strong in the 18th century in the West, that everybody has a right to property, and that if you've got property, then you've got the right to vote and the right to government. And that property is a fundamental right, and the law, and therefore ethics, should spring from regarding that basic right as basic. Relativists believe that their approach is the natural approach. It fits in with what human nature and indeed animal nature is like. And it says all ethics are relative. No, it doesn't say this. I say all ethics are relative to other species, other life forms, other beings. What I mean by that is, if you believe that ethics only affect human beings and that we don't apply them to how we behave towards horses, dogs, cats, snails, mosquitoes, then you're a relativist. Why? Because your ethics stop at human beings, whereas a true universalist, like a true Buddhist, for example, would believe that ethics apply to all life forms. Ethics of the old sci-fi thing Star Trek, which had come back into the news after William Shatner became the oldest man to go into space a couple of weeks ago at the age of 90. So that's relativism. Hume's law. This is an important one. All statements about what is the case are descriptive, also known as positive statements, descriptive statements. All other statements are value judgments, also known as normative. The two types of statement inhabit different semantic dimensions, different universes, you might say, and it's always invalid to base one kind of statement on the other kind. Now, that is Hume's law, that you cannot infer an ought from an is, or vice versa. You cannot infer an is from an ought. Breaking Hume's law is one example of what philosophers call the naturalistic fallacy. We'll see some other examples later. All adjectives are value judgments, so cannot go into a descriptive scientific statement. Instead, you've got to measure things. I am nearly 2 meters tall, I wish I was, and if you say I am tall, that's subjective. If you say I am 1.9 meters tall, that is descriptive. So adjectives that are actually numbers, they can be objective, but adjectives which are words are pretty much without exception subjective, and therefore they're in the world of oughts. There's no such thing as a science of ethics. So I was at Cambridge as an undergraduate 100 million years ago, and in Cambridge back then, there was a school called the School of Moral Science. And the rest of the university was a bit irritated by this because they regarded it as an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. Morality isn't about science. Science is about what is. Morals are about what ought to be. And you can't fuse them together like that. That's Hume's law. Two different universes, the world of science and what is, and the world of ethics and what should be. Can't go logically from one to the other. The world's main ethical frameworks. Firstly, not because it's the most important, but it's the one that's most irritating. Darwinism, social Darwinism, apex predators get the prizes. So in this, we don't say it's very nice, but we say the way of the world is that the strongest one wins. The apex predator, the crocodile, can eat anything smaller. Big snakes can eat a lot. Jellyfish behave as if they're nearly immortal. Big corporations eat smaller corporations. Taller people tend to get elected more than smaller people. Men historically have dominated politics over women because birth control didn't become possible until 1964. And in this view, it's not so much that they think it's that good, they think it's the realistic way to behave. So Darwinism, survival of the fittest, social Darwinism, applying the law of the jungle to society and to the economy, is favoured as a realism by its proponents. Almost opposite to that, we have postmodernism, which is extreme relativism, says really ethics are the same thing as good manners or fashion, and my view of ethics is as good as yours. There is no such thing as what they call a grand narrative, so there's certainly no such thing as universal ethics in this view. Nihilism, the view that nothing really matters, in the words of Bohemian Rhapsody, the song by Queen from 1976, long before all of you were born, nothing really matters. This is an ethical view in the sense that it says it doesn't particularly matter what you do because nothing really matters. That it's a despairing point of view. It's a view that some people hold, and it's a symptom of depression and other mental illnesses. But it is an ethical framework, even though it's kind of anti-ethics. Next one. We group these together. Existentialism, care theory, feminism. The ethical framework here is to be authentically you, be true to yourself, care, and be appropriate. Care means care for your loved ones, but care about life, care about society. The opposite of nihilism and a nothing really matters attitude. And behave appropriately to your context. Existentialism is centrally about being authentic, being sincere, not putting on an act. So existentialists tend to be left-wing and they tend to hate advertising. Next one, religion, simple, do what your religion tells you. End of. Next one, legalism. Morality and ethics are enshrined in the law of the land. As simple as that. Next one, virtue ethics. Assuming that you agree with what virtues are, and of course not everybody does, but this is a majority thing. Virtue ethics says display virtues, hide vices, cultivate virtues, become a better person, behave in a way that will make you a better person, and avoid vices. We'll come on to classical virtues and vices next time. Next one, consequentialism. This says that the way to judge acts, ethically speaking, is a good act is one that has good results, consequences. The key ethical judgment is, does it have good results or not? And the last framework, secular deontology. A good act is one that complies with Kant's categorical imperative. Well, of course, we now need to say, what is Kant's categorical imperative? But before we do that, we're going to elaborate consequentialism a little bit. The main type of consequentialism is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the maxim that a good person promotes the greatest good of the greatest number. Modern democratic politicians tend to automatically be utilitarian in that they believe that what they're proposing in their manifestos and what they're doing as ministers is promoting the greatest good of the greatest number. The trouble is that what a conservative believes to be the greatest good and what a liberal or Labour person believes to be the greatest good aren't quite the same. Act utilitarianism applies that formula, greatest good of the greatest number, cliche in democratic party political policy formation, to each decision. So when you make any decision at all, you apply act utilitarianism. What promotes the greatest good of the greatest number? What has the best consequences for the most people? That's fine. The big problem with this is the minority. So if you're a British politician and you're trying to solve the Irish question, what do you do about the Protestants in Northern Ireland that Oliver Cromwell put there in the 1650s, I mean, and that William III kept there after the Battle of the Boyne, because they're a majority inside Northern Ireland, but they're a minority inside Ireland. Well, utilitarianism's answer, the greatest good of the greatest number, doesn't help at all, because are you talking about the greatest number in Éire, the whole island of Ireland? Are you talking about the greatest number in Northern Ireland? Because if you're doing the second, that means you can always get what you want simply by redrawing boundaries. What is called in political circles gerrymandering. You get the greatest good of the greatest number by artificially defining the greatest number by drawing boundaries to give you what you want. Another problem with utilitarianism is disagreement about what is the greatest good. Is it freedom? Is it protection from COVID? So, if it's freedom, shouldn't make people wear masks. If it's protection from COVID, as I would have thought any sane person thinks it is, but that's just me, then you make them wear masks. So, greatest good isn't necessarily all that much help. Stricter than act utilitarianism is rule utilitarianism, and that is, apply the criterion to the formulation of rules, that is the greatest good of the greatest number, make a rule that gives you the greatest good of the greatest number, but then apply the rule itself, and applying the rule trumps any act utilitarianism for any individual decision. So you've got an ethically robust set of rules that can't be wiggled around in any one decision. So much for introduction to the consequentialism and utilitarianism. Now, getting back to Kant, Kant is the top ethics philosopher of the West so far, top of the hit parade in ethics. He says in his categorical imperative, KCI for short, act according to a rule that you would happily and willingly have everyone in the world also act on. That's the categorical imperative. So it's do as you would be done by. Don't do anything to anybody else you wouldn't like them to do to you. It's a little bit more than that. It's when you do something, think about the rule that you're enshrining in doing it and be honest with yourself. Would you like it applied to anybody else? So when you shout at somebody, are you okay with having anybody shout at you who thinks you deserve to be shouted at? If yes, then that's all right. If no, then you shouldn't be shouting either. It's quite close to rule utilitarianism, but we'll explore how close in a later session. Duty is the top virtue in Kant's ethics. And as far as he's concerned, you recognize somebody doing their duty because they're getting no ancillary satisfactions. They're not climbing the stairway to heaven. They're not getting a sense of pride from people saying how good they are. It is pure grim duty. And the grimmer it is, the more virtuous you are, in Kant's view. So the categorical imperative sources what the content of duty is, the rule that you would happily and willingly have everybody else in the world also act on, and the categorical imperative also sources definitions of good and right. Now for religious deontology. Deontology is the ethical frameworks, including Kant, that say some things are just right and some things are just wrong. Never mind the motive and never mind the consequences. The act itself is just right or wrong. That's deontology. The act itself is either right or wrong. So, in religious deontology, God is omnipotent and omniscient. He can do everything, omnipotent. He knows everything, omniscient. His might is also our right. He can make black white and bad good because he's God. There is no reason, no justification. He speaks, that's it. The word of God is what it is. End of. Hinduism and Buddhism are religions that believe in reincarnation and in karma. The idea in karma is that you carry forward from previous lives your good and bad deeds, and that you may get rewarded for your good deeds and punished for your bad deeds, but we don't know when. So the fact that you're having a bad life now might mean that you're being punished for a previous life, or it might mean that you're being tested for big promotion next time, and we don't know which it is. So it's very frustrating because it's not like bookkeeping where we can do debits and credits and add them up and we know where we are, because we don't know whether our suffering this time is a direct punishment or a testing of our character to make us even better. So it's a bit of a dead end, really. Gods and God eternally transcends the virtues and the vices. They're beyond them because the virtues and the vices are created by the gods. Karma is a universal law of ethics akin to gravity in the is world. But the trouble is that we don't know, because neither in Hinduism nor in Buddhism is there a completely definitive code of ethics. Both of them do have codes. Noble Eightfold Way in Buddhism, for example, but there is a fairly high level of abstraction, or they're at too great a level of specificity, and so it's quite hard to form personal judgments in some cases. So we're not quite sure what karma says is good and bad. We can adopt a universalist view and say, if you hurt other people, that's bad. If you don't hurt other people and improve their life, that's good. And most people who believe in karma reincarnation do take a view like that, but we can't be sure. And lastly for this session, law and ethics. The philosophy of law is called jurisprudence. And because ethics overlaps with law, we'll do a tiny little bit of this because there's some insight to be got from jurisprudence. Firstly, natural law is justice and also due process. And it's good and it's right. Justice is sensed inherently. It's not learnt. In other words, people have an inherent sense of justice. One of the frameworks inside jurisprudence is a kind of might is right, that sovereignty dictates the law. The king in the olden days decides what the law is, and that's that, so that what's legal and illegal, lawful and unlawful, comes from the sovereign. Religion still has this because the sovereign is God. The Constitution is another source of laws. Hans Kelsen said that constitutions dictate laws, and the Constitution could either be the result of a victory in battle and the victorious side imposing its law, so Norman conquest in England in 1066, the Normans, who were Vikings who lived in France for 100 years, then invaded England, and they took over the Anglo-Saxons, and they dictated what the law was in England ever afterwards. So any country with a written constitution has got a basic framework for its law. And a constitution is a basic code or basic law. And the law is what judges recognize as law according to one particular kind of... now I've got to stop there. So I'll pause this. Hello again. I just had to answer the door because there's been a gang round Armidale kicking in garages. I said, come and have a look at ours, see if we can get a fingerprint. They got a shoe print, which is something. But apparently there's lots and lots of them last night in Armidale. They don't know why, because hardly anybody's lost anything. Just got doors hit. Getting back to this, though, the Hart view of the law is very pragmatic. It says, in kind of evasive, in my opinion, it says, the law is what judges recognise as the law. Well, fine, and how do they decide what's the law? By previous cases, in the case of a common law country, and by what's on the statute book. So saying it's what the judges recognise is artificially to privilege the judges, and not that much help in my personal opinion. But he was an emeritus professor and very highly distinguished top professor of law at Oxford, so it's not really for the likes of me to be criticising the likes of him. Next one. The idea that just because something's a law doesn't mean you have to obey it. The Latin phrase, lex injusti non est lex, that an unjust law is not a law. So here's the idea of natural law, natural justice, due process. Due process is the process of hearing a trial properly and hearing both sides properly. An unjust law, such as making you pay tax when you're getting nothing back for it, or you're just funding the dictator's or sovereign's lifestyle, you've got the right to disobey it in this view. That's a natural law view. And then finally, Hobbes, 400 years ago, wrote a book called Leviathan, and there is a phrase in that which gets quoted a lot, nasty, brutish and short. This is the view that you have to have law in any community, any society, any neighbourhood. Otherwise, Darwinism applies, and the strongest also might be the most ruthless bullies rule. So the only way of curbing nature in people, jungle nature, is to have some law. Otherwise, life is nasty, brutish, and short. Now, this is a matter of personal opinion. My personal opinion is that's absolutely right. If you don't have law and rules, then whoever is the strongest and biggest bully will get their way, and I wouldn't want to live in a society where that happens. Because somebody who's naturally strong and a bully is going to get their way more than we would like, even when there is law. So if there isn't law, we dread to think how bad it would be. Now, the main things I want you to get from jurisprudence when it comes to a sense of ethics is Kelson's view that law comes from a constitution, and a constitution is a basic law when the country started off. So with a profession, there is a code, and we're going to do code in depth, of course, later, and the identity of the country in this, or of the profession, is quite tied up with its particular basic law or code. And with that, we've finished the introductory lecture, and if there was anything that you didn't understand or you thought was in need of greater elaboration, then say so in the forum or email me, or both as you see fit, and I will talk to you again in topic 2. And see you then. Bye-bye.